Saddam, when an injustice is committed against us, we have pretty much two different options we can take in terms of how to react because the situation is very disturbing. And in order for our brain to grapple with it, we can either accept that an injustice has occurred and come to the very scary conclusion that sometimes in this life, things happen to people that are undeserved. Like good things can happen to bad people, bad things can happen to good people, that sort of thing. Um, you can be totally innocent and then suddenly be extremely mistreated for no reason. And that's a scary conclusion to come to. So, your other option would be to start to try to justify in your mind retroactively what happened and find a way to make peace with it. And that might sound like the more enlightened path, but it's actually the road to delusion. So rather than accepting that what happened to you was unfair and you simply did not deserve it, you might, in order to maintain peace with the world and your vision of the world as a just world, you might try to somehow justify what happened and come to the conclusion that if it happened, then you must have deserved it if it happened to you. And there are very big, intense philosophical and psychological ramifications for this worldview or this fallacy, this cognitive bias. But it's a surprisingly common one. So, in this video, I'd like to explore the just-world fallacy, the belief that we get what we deserve, on three levels. Basically, the individual level in terms of abuse, the societal level in terms of oppression, and the Islamic perspective. Trigger warning for this video, it includes discussions of abuse, torture, and genocide. For the individual level, I'm going to dip into my experience as a clinical counselor. I work with a lot of people who have trauma, and unfortunately, it's pretty common for people who have faced abuse or neglect, physical, sexual, or emotional, to internalize the trauma, to internalize the injustices that transpired against them, even more so if they have CPTSD and they experience the trauma from childhood. Because imagine if you're a child and you have, it's the only world you know. Mistreatment is all you know. What is your standard for proper treatment? You don't have one. So you won't identify the way you're being treated necessarily as mistreatment. You might come to the conclusion that this is just the way things are. And in order to make sense of that, you can either internalize or externalize the problem. Externalizing the problem is healthy when the problem is external to you, meaning there is nothing about the survivor of the abuse that caused the abuse to happen. The abuse happened because of the abuser, not because of the survivor. So, understanding that there is nothing that you as an individual could have done differently to prevent the injustice from having happened to you. We want to sometimes think that there is something we could have done differently in order to feel more safe in the world and in ourselves, to feel like, maybe if I had just played the situation a little bit differently, whether you're a child living in a situation with abusive parents, or whether you're an adult living in a relationship with an abusive romantic partner. Oh, maybe if I had spoken to this person differently, or if I had carried myself a different way, or, taken some different approach or strategy, then the abuse would not have happened. It feels less scary almost to come to the conclusion that we could have played our cards in a certain way to prevent the abuse from happening to us, because it's comforting thought. It makes us feel like that means we can prevent the abuse from happening to us in the future. The unfortunate downside to coming to this conclusion is that we end up blaming ourselves for our own mistreatment. So, blaming the victim, but in this case, the victim is yourself. You're blaming yourself. And this is really common. And it's one of the main reasons, unfortunately, that you see a lot of people who are, let's say, whether someone was raped or if they were beaten, or any sort of horrible atrocity has been enacted against them. And then rather than seeing them feel anger toward the villain who has done this to them, they instead internalize the problem and they feel anger and shame toward themselves. This is a common reaction, and it might seem weird at first, like, why would you feel shame if the other person is the one who did something to be ashamed of? They did it against you. They should be ashamed. Why are you ashamed? Well, commonly human beings tend to feel shame when an injustice has been transpired against them, has been committed against them, because it's the consequence of wanting to feel like you could have done something differently, and that next time you will do something differently to avoid the abuse. Now, if you're listening to this and you have a skeptical counter response forming in your head, like, wait a minute, but I could have done something differently. Like, let's say someone is in an abusive relationship, and they disobeyed their controlling spouse. Then they might blame themselves and say, well, I wouldn't have gotten beaten if I didn't disobey my spouse. By disobeying, I I chose to disobey them, therefore I got beaten, therefore it's my fault. But there's like a logical chain of events, and you are choosing in that scenario to frame the start point incorrectly. So if you're only looking at what's within your control because you have already accepted that your partner is not someone you can reason with, then you're going to say, okay, I can't talk to them, I can't calm them down, or I can try but it won't always work. So all I can work with is my own actions. How can I act to prevent myself from falling into a difficult situation, bringing this abuse upon myself? But pay attention to the way this mindset is removing any moral accountability from the other person in the situation, in this case, the abuser. Every human being is a moral actor, meaning an individual who takes actions, and those actions could be moral or immoral. So if you're only focusing on yourself and what you can control as an individual, and you internalize to such an extent that you're no longer even thinking about the morality of the other human being in the equation who is subjecting you to the abuse, then you can see how over time, especially with a more long term chronic injustice type of situation, people really start to internalize the abuse to be able to live with it. You might ask yourself, well, why would someone want to be able to live with it? In many cases, they have no choice, right? If you're a child, what are you going to do? Your options are incredibly limited, sadly. Even if you're in an abusive relationship and you're an adult, you might not be financially self sufficient to leave the relationship. Also, the abuser might have broken down your self esteem to the point where you don't believe you are capable of rising up and standing on your own as an adult in this world. So there's many different factors at play, but essentially, when it comes to the just world fallacy, it's really sad the way we can hurt ourselves as individuals by, unfortunately, in our quest for empowerment, trying to think we have total control over a situation, which we never do. There's a lot of different variables at play, and our own decisions are only one of those variables. Yet, unfortunately, in our quest for empowerment, we sometimes end up disempowering ourselves so much by only focusing on what we could have done differently to avoid getting beaten or raped or whatever horrifying things people can get subjected to. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is accepting that you are in an unjust situation, or if you're looking back at your childhood trauma, accepting that you deserved better than what you got. And it can be very healing for people in therapy to go through that journey of really looking back through everything that they went through growing up, and realizing this was messed up. Like, I lived with it for a long time, and just in survival mode I had to contend with that, and I had just had to accept it as normal. But looking back, this was not normal. And how healing to acknowledge that abuse is not normal, and that what happened to you should not have happened to you. It was immoral. You were subjected to something that you did not ever deserve, and that this world has things happen in it frequently that are not deserved by innocent victims. Now, no one wants to think of themselves as a victim, and no one is just a victim. There's a million different dimensions to each individual. But acknowledging that we've been through something that we did not deserve to go through can be the first step to getting out of that situation if we're still in it, or healing from that situation if we're looking back on it, but we still have these cognitive patterns to this day that are affecting us, even though, like for a lot of people, even if they're no longer in the abusive situation, because of the way they grew up, they they think that abuse is love because they've been taught that that's what love looks like, that being controlled is being loved, or that they do deserve whatever they get. So they're quicker to blame themselves than they are to recognize the other person's misbehavior. So essentially, coming to recognize that you have been a victim of something can be weirdly empowering, because it's basically making us more aware of the other moral actors in the universe. And then by becoming more aware of them, we can feel more empowered or more motivated and driven to take action against them. And it's like how some people ask, oh, why does a person, a victim of intimate partner violence, why do they stay in their relationship? And there's so many different factors, some I briefly touched on, but one of those barriers is psychological, although there are also practical factors, like finances, and they don't have many other options. But psychologically, they might not recognize that they deserve better, that they do deserve better than the treatment they are getting. And there is a world of help out there for people who are willing to go through the difficult process of claiming that help. There's a network of authorities and social workers and therapists and nurses and all of these different people who are trained to help and just waiting for someone to ask for help so they can help them out of their difficult situation. So, if anything I'm saying is resonating with anyone out there, you could even do a Google search in incognito mode and find all of those resources for yourself, like typing in resources for, like, help, I think I'm being abused, or anything like that. And the internet has a million different resources that will pop up right away, and there's ways you can do it discreetly and safely. um, but it all starts with a mentality shift, that we do not get what we deserve all of the time in this life. And being honest with ourselves about that fact can be the first step toward fighting for what we do deserve. This second part of the video can be way too long if I'm not careful, and it's already dark out. So I ended up taking out like a 10-minute section about American history. This part of the video is going to cover the Just-World Fallacy on a societal level, basically looking into the different ways people tend to justify oppression. And for this discussion, I will be leaning on my experience as an Iraqi living in the United States. Um, so a few years ago, 2020, when there were a lot of protests, or as white supremacists might refer to them, riots, uh, for the Black Lives Matter movement after the murder of George Floyd, I remember I made a post, and I titled the post "Justice Before Order." Basically, I was responding to this common critique of the movement at the time, where people would complain that, like basically they didn't like all of the hubbub. They wanted things to return to peaceful and calm. They're like, why is everyone going crazy out of nowhere all of a sudden? Like, can everyone just relax? What's with all of these, like, people are, the media really focused on people are looting and breaking store windows, and a lot of people seemed a lot more upset about the destruction of property than they were about the actual loss of life with the murder of George Floyd and the murder of countless black men before him and since, by the police in big cities in the United States. So when I made my post, I was basically criticizing this idea that, like, the people were claiming that the protests were not peaceful and we should return to peace. Peace is a good thing. And I was basically saying that, or a lot of people were saying that the status quo might be peaceful for one group of people, the privileged, but it's not peaceful for a different group of people. In this case, black people who were finding it scary, are still, unfortunately, to this day in many cities, finding it not safe to leave their house in some cases. Like, any encounter with the cops can suddenly take a wrong turn and end up deadly for them. And so that's not peace. The status quo is not peace for minorities, but it is peace if you're in a privileged group and you're kind of blissfully oblivious of that fact. So I basically said, justice before order. Like, you're upset that there's all this in order, there disorder, like there's all of this like hubbub that's going on. But justice is more important than your society looking calm and settled on the surface. So a lot of people um, get very upset with protesters because they think the protesters are causing this big hubbub and disturbing the peace. The protesters are protesting something, though. They're protesting a lack of peace. So there isn't peace. There's just the illusion of peace. And you don't like the protesters because you don't want that illusion that your society is just to be disrupted. Like, we're bursting your bubble, basically. And the reason I bring up this story to start off this discussion is that one person commented online, I'll never forget this. He said, justice. So I said justice before order. And he said, justice comes through order, you piece of blah, 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 blah. Like, he was swearing at me. He was very upset. But his main point was, um, justice can only be achieved through obeying laws. And I thought to myself, that would only be true if the laws themselves were just. So that's the question now, isn't it? Are the laws just? Do you believe that you live in a morally just society? Well, depending on your answer to that question, you're going to come to very different conclusions about a lot of world events. Because every atrocity that every nation has ever committed in every span of time throughout history has been pretty much justified by the people committing the atrocity at the time. Like, even if you look at slavery at the time in the United States, there were abolitionists who were anti-slavery, but they weren't the majority. That wasn't the majority view. Most people seem to be very happy to conclude that for one race to enslave another race was simply the natural order of things. And even in the American school system, we are taught that, everyone in the past used to be racist and now we have progressed since then. But that's not exactly true. Like, I remember when I learned about slavery as a little girl in school, I was like, wow, I'm really happy I didn't grow up in that time period. What an evil time period filled with evil people. But no, this illusion of progress, it's like, no, the American government has continued to do exactly what it was designed to do from the beginning. It was literally founded on genocide and genocide and slavery persist to this day in different forms. At the time, it was genocide of the indigenous populations and slavery of African Americans, and now to this day we have an overrepresentation of African Americans in prisons, and they are still used in the prison industrial complex as slave labor. And there's lots more I can say about that, but I'll just to cap it here for now. We are living through a genocide right now. Alhamdulillah, there's been a ceasefire that Israel keeps violating, but it's been a bit less violent for the past 6 weeks, and inshallah, only God knows what the next phase of the ceasefire could hold. Now, going back to the example of the Black Lives Matter movement, that movement became so popular and gained so much ground on a national scale that the American government had to do something about it, and it ended up getting co opted by the Democratic Party, where important movements go to die. Um, if you if you believe the world is just and you live in the United States, there's two mainstream views that you might use to uphold your worldview that the world is just. In an American's case, it would be, that the system is fair, and either if you're Republican, there's nothing wrong and you don't need to change anything, or if you're a Democrat, there is something wrong and you change it by going through the system. Those are kind of the two differing conclusions you can come to, and like if you do believe the world is just. So if you're a Republican, you might have more of this, nationalistic, tribalistic pride, this unearned sense of superiority. And it might not even come from a place of hate. It can come from a place of love. Like you just love your own culture, and your personal identity is wrapped up in some sort of vision for the country. And unfortunately, that's going to make you tend to come to the conclusion that the country can do no wrong. Therefore, any critique of the country from people whose experiences differ from your own, you will view as threatening, and you will dismiss those critiques, and you will come to the conclusion that the people complaining are the ones in the wrong. Like you'll be doing the victim blaming. And that might look like blaming immigrants and blaming minorities and saying they're inherently lazy or inherently criminal, and that's why they're facing the injustices that they face. It's not injustice, it's deserved, because America is perfect, because life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Never mind that slavery is codified into the law. Now, if you're a liberal, uh, you are kind of sold the lie that, like, okay, fine, you might operate more from a place of empathy instead of national pride, but we can kind of appease your empathy through identity politics. We can give you a black president, and maybe now you'll stop complaining about racism, for example. Never mind that that president paved the way for the policies of migrants being separated from their children and being placed in jails, and at the southern border. Never mind that Democratic presidents in some cases deport more immigrants than are deported during the Trump administration. So it's like the same inherently unliberal policies are perpetuated by liberal politicians during their administration. It's just that the liberal media doesn't report on it. They only report on it, like, liberals only report on how the country is wrong when a Republican is in charge, and Republicans only report on how the country is wrong when a liberal is in charge. And they have different narratives that they use, but basically it's not that the system is wrong. It's not that there's in their minds, it's not that there's this unjust oppressive system. It's that there is it's like the other party's fault, or it's immigrants' fault, or it's minorities' fault. Blame anyone except the system. And if you want to change the system, you have to go through the system. These are the narratives we are sold. You have to vote, and you have to whatever, like it, all of the radical solutions that, quote unquote radical solutions, are considered extreme, and they are mocked, and they are rejected. And to me, what's worthy of being mocked is the idea that we should ask our oppressor to stop oppressing us, and we should expect that to work. That to me is worthy of mockery. But if you believe that society is just, then you're going to be stuck blaming the victims to uphold your worldview. Like, oh, shame on you for not voting, shame on you, all of those different things, instead of recognizing the oppressive system that surrounds you. And it's a scary, uncomfortable thought. Like, it's not fun to acknowledge that uh, the people who have power over us are war criminals, and they are inherently indifferent to our plight. um, but it's true. It's just simply true. It's so obviously the case. And that might not be obvious to certain privileged people. But if you're interested in living a life where you want for your fellow human being the same thing you would want for yourself, basic human rights. It becomes necessary to consider the possibility that the world might not be just. Because if you start looking at the world from the assumption that it is a just place, then you're going to like your cognitive bias is just going to, confirmation bias. You're going to reject any examples to the contrary. They're going to offend your sensibilities. And you're going to look for any evidence that proves your point. So instead, it's like just clear your mind and think that it's possible that society is not just, or that it does need to be changed. And then you can start to have a conversation about, like, well, okay, what isn't just about it? Because nobody who commits atrocities claims to be committing atrocities. They claim that what they're doing is justified. And the insidious thing about a Western democratic system is the illusion of choice. I had a friend tell me, Trump's not going to be any better. Why wouldn't you vote for Kamala? Um, and the idea that I should have to choose between one of two corporate imperial war criminals, that I should have to validate the very system that is committing genocide against my people and against many peoples on this earth is incredibly insulting. And it's weird the way people identify. It's frustrating the way people identify with, one party or another. But it's like, at the end of the day, the fact that they still identify with some sort of mainstream version of society indicates to me they do believe society at its core is just. And because of that, they're going to get defensive, and they're going to like really want to preserve their impression of this like framework that they believe can yield justice. If we just give it a chance, if we just give it enough of a chance, then maybe some sort of good change can come about. Because what are the alternatives, they ask? And they don't ask this sincerely. They ask it rhetorically. They don't care what alternatives are. They don't want to hear about the different ways we can actually come together and create change, aside from through the oppressive systems and through the government that's committing war crimes right now and always has. So it's really frustrating to see, like, especially with liberals, the hypocrisy that comes up because they claim to care about human rights. And then, like, Trump doesn't have a filter. And he talks about ethnically cleansing Gaza, and he says it pretty much very straight up, and he says it with pride, and a lot of people like can hear how disgusting it sounds, and they'll react to it. A lot of people who weren't reacting about Palestine for the past year and a half of genocide, they had no reaction whatsoever, because it was their president of choice who was committing the genocide, funding the genocide. When it was Biden, they didn't have anything to say. But because Biden is sounding nice while he's signing the billions of dollars of checks of 1,000-pound bombs that can be used in this world's largest concentration camp that's population is half 50% children. While Biden is doing that, he's sounding nice. He's saying, oh yes, we want Israel to be very careful. Oh, this is just a sad reality of war, blah 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 blah. Justifying mass murder of an entire ethnic group, and in like extremely horrific ways, but saying it with a somber attitude that's more palatable to liberal sensibilities. And so that was good enough for them, apparently. But what was not, so when Trump comes out and says it directly, like, yeah, we're gonna make, we're gonna own Gaza, and we're gonna get rid of all the people there, and we'll give them something better, whatever. Like, he hasn't even thought it through. No filter, just top of his head, like a drunken uncle saying the first thing that pops into his mind. He's like, yeah, whatever about them, we're just gonna like remove everyone who lives in Palestine. We're going to remove them from Palestine, and then we'll own Palestine, and we'll make it this beautiful beachfront property. And the liberals are like, ew, that sounds so evil. Like, you're talking about these like genocide victims, and you're advocating for ethnic cleansing, and you're making it into a fun business opportunity for you and your cronies. And so now it's like they can start to see the cracks in the mask, but their cognitive view of the world only allows them to see the injustice and the extreme oppression when it comes from a side where they expect oppression to come from. So they expect Trump to be evil, and then Trump says something with no filter so they can hear the evil. But it's like, why do you need someone to outright say that they are for ethnic cleansing in order for you to recognize it as ethnic cleansing? Why do you fall for the like if the nice words that Biden or Kamala can say? Why is that sufficient for you? You are seeing ethnic cleansing happening either way. Who cares if the person behind the microphone is saying racial slurs or not? Are they committing acts of atrocity against another race of human beings? Like, so this is what really frustrates me. And I this video is turning into a rant here, but really what I mean to communicate is that your brain, if you believe the world is just, or the current, like, current president, current administration, or system has the capacity to potentially yield justice, if you believe that, you're going to dismiss a lot of atrocities in the name of hoping things can get better if we can just come together. And do you see how similar this sounds to my earlier example of the person in the abusive relationship saying, if I just play my cards right, if I obey my abuser and like do things in the proper order to prevent myself from provoking or triggering them, like maybe I can make things better for myself. It's like you're tiptoeing around the injustices and just like appeasing the system that dominates you because you don't see alternatives. But there are alternatives. And so at the very least, we have to start from a place of getting really comfortable with criticizing our society, including maybe the angle where you once found hope in our society. This government is an evil government. It always has been. Most governments are by nature. And the willingness to look at human atrocity and recognize where it comes from is a necessary ingredient to fighting that atrocity. So we can't be precious about our worldviews here. People are dying by the masses, families, thousands of them being wiped off the registry. I'm going to end this section now. I could go on forever, but I'm going to end it with two clips I wanted to share with you, basically to put my money where my mouth is and prove to you what I'm talking about. The first clip is going to be a conversation between two horrible men, but in this case, one of the men is representing a more morally reasonable view than the other. So it's a conversation between Tucker Carlson, a white supremacist, and Piers Morgan, Mr. Do You Condemn? Two terrible people. They've made a career out of in reinforcing systems of extreme oppression. But in this conversation, just a short clip I wanted to share, you will see what it looks like in action when the human mind finds itself willing to justify literally the most evil things imaginable. Like there's no limit to what you can justify as long as you call it something that is palatable in your mind.
If you're intentionally killing civilians, you probably shouldn't beat your chest and brag about it. Maybe you can make.
I agree with that.
Maybe you make the case that we had to do it or whatever, but you should.
I agree.
You should weep, and that's evil, and you should just say it's evil. And I know it's really threatening to.
Is it evil?
Ben Shapiro to say that or whatever, but
is it evil
to kill civilians on purpose? Yeah, it is. I think it is.
Really?
Kids and children. Well, how is it not actually?
In a war?
Well, you can call it whatever you want. How is it right to kill women and children?
I didn't say, because I think there is a moral right behind you if you are literally...
To kill women and children?
Really? If there's a world war that threatens if it threatens the entire world, yes.
Some people killed your kids, like your 8-year-old? Like,
well, how is that children,
morally justifiable?
Well, because actually you have to... Well, by your criteria...
It's disgusting.
Okay, so no war is morally justified.
I mean, I think it's pretty hard to justify... I mean, yeah, I'm
Any
sure...
war?
A pure defensive action, sure. But all I'm saying, look, it's all ugly. It's all hard to stomach. I've actually seen some of it up close, super ugly.
You can say that. You can say you hate it.
May I
but the fact you quibble with it being morally justified.
To intentionally kill non-combatants, women and children, I think we can say that's wrong. In fact, I thought that was the thing we were fighting against.
In fact, I thought that's the thing we were fighting against, Tucker Carlson says. And this clip is so fascinating to me. And it's not my role to pass judgment on Tucker Carlson's soul. It was really disorienting to hear him be the voice of reason in a conversation. I've heard from some people that he, he's only taken interest in the Palestinian cause from an angle of, Bethlehem being the birthplace of Prophet Jesus, from like a Christian perspective. He's a Christian. He's really interested in the safety and welfare of the Christians in Palestine. And so there might be some sort of still a tribalistic angle to the way he's applying his morals. But for the purpose of just this discussion, and I don't know how his mindset might continue to evolve in the future, regardless of the purity of his intentions, he is holding the perspective of like, okay, we see this obvious oppression, and isn't this what we're claiming is so evil? Like, this is terrorism, and we're claiming that because we have to fight terrorists, war is justified, even though war sucks. And it's like you've lost the thread of logic, and there's no rationality remaining in your actions if you're now the one committing the terrorism in order to fight off the terrorists. And Piers can't see that, because the reason he can't see that is because he has already started the conversation from the worldview that the Western Empire is just inherently, and the Islamic world is unjust inherently. And so again, it's like his world is just. He has the Just-World Fallacy, Piers Morgan does. And so he's operating from this perspective, this assumption. Because we are the good guys by default and we're fighting the bad guys by default, anything we do, literally anything, falls under the umbrella of justifiable because it's necessary for the good guys to win over the bad guys. And so now I want to show you the second clip where you get to hear a firsthand account from one of these so-called bad guys. A young man, really he's a boy, who was a hostage, a Palestinian hostage in an Israeli prison. There's 10,000 Palestinians held in Israeli prisons right now. They're not charged with anything. They're just kidnapped and held and tortured. And the mistreatment is incredible. You will hear his firsthand account. It's just a short clip, another short clip, all the trigger warnings to it. But, if please do take the time to listen to it, because if he can recount his story, especially if you have any ambivalence about this subject, if you're going to dismiss claims of Palestinian suffering, the least you can do is listen to accounts of that suffering. In that clip, he not only recounts the extreme torture he faced, but he and other hostages face at the hands of the Israeli forces, but he also talks about how they justify in their minds what the Zionists do to them, and how there is no line they won't cross because they are just by default in their own minds. The Zionist cause is just by default. It's not that there are universal moral principles that apply equally to everyone. It's that there are good guys and there are bad guys, and our society is just, so anything that we do that people complain is unjust, that's on them, and they deserve it. And that's why this fallacy is so dangerous, the just world hypothesis, that there is no line that can be crossed and you will recognize, there is no evil too big for someone to justify when they believe the just world fallacy. Let's take a look.
مش خوف، يعني السليم كان يخاف من الضرب، انا قطعوا رجلي بطلت فيش خوف. انا اسمي عادل تيسير عادل صبيح، من سكان مدينه غزه. قعدت تقريبا سنه الا 8 يوم تقريبا. انبطلت داخل اسرائيل بغصب عني، تم تعذيبي وحتى قوم ابدا تمضي بغصب عنك، انت هيك ميت، روحها ما تهمناش يعني. مت بنروحك غزه ميت، اجتنا حي روح ميت، لانكم كلكم ارهابيين، كلكم ارهابيين، كلكم يعني كل غزه تحت غزه. من الطفل ارهابي، الشيخ ارهابي، البنت ارهابيه، النساء الكبار بالسن ارهابيه، الختياريه كله ارهابيين، كل بالنسبه لهم كلهم ارهابيين. تم تعذيبي في الادويه اللي هي اللي بتعالجني، تم تعذيبي فيها، والابر 26 عمليه لواحد مقطوع. كانوا يتدربوا علينا، والناس كل يوم بتموت، سقطه قلبيه، طخ، يعني مراحل تعذيب. انا تعذبت في المستشفى بالشفر، بعد ما يخلص من العمليه في البنج صحينا بالشفره، في ابره غزك في الابره، هيك غز اذيه كفوف تاع الاسعاف بالدخن، بعد ما اخذ سيجاره يحرقني في السيجاره. جسمي كله انا قدحات في كل جسمي كان هيك في القدحات، الكلبشات بيحزقهم عليك، بس حجز الكلبشات ايدك بتصير سوداء. رجلي هادم يعني بقدرش اكثر من 10 دقائق اقف عليها. انا رجل واحده، في واحد جنبي مثلا برجلتين، اقول الحمد لله احسن منه، اقوي حالي انا احسن منه. اللي برجلتين اللي ابو ملوش يدين بقول والله انا بخش الحمام بغسل بدبر حالي، انا احسن منه. والدم كان يسيل منا كل يوم. شفنا الاكل من اسبوعين باقسام الصليب اللي بداخل النقل. بقول له شربنا ميه، بقول لي بدك ميه، انا حجيب لك ميه. جاب الميه، بقول هي الميه، يدير المي، بقول لي فيش مي، يشرب يكب على الارض، يجيب الاكل ويخبص عليه على الارض. انه كل سبت عندهم عيد يجيبوا يعملوا حفله شواء يشوى عباب القسم. بس اصعب يوم، اصعب ما اصعبه، انه يوم ما ضاني بغصب عني عمليه بتر رجل. بقول انا اموتك، انا لقيتها بدي انيمك واموتك. لحست الارض لما صار معي حصاوي، الارض لحستها من كثر العذاب، ما فيش ادويه من اللي حصل في الكلى، الحسيه والجدري وفي الدم وفي الحكه والعين. انا كنت عامل فيها عمليه، خربوا لي اياها في الليزر الكشنات والضرب، عظامي ما بقدرش احركه مكسر. يعني انا قاعد وموجوع ما مصدق اني اخلص.
شو كان حلمك قبل الحرب؟
انا قبل الحرب يعني كنا حلمنا نفتح محل الحلويات يعني احنا كنا انا وابويا صناعيه حلويات، بنشتغل محلات الحلويات. حلمنا في العلاج، اكيد حلمنا في الامان اكثر شيء. كل غزه بتحلم في الامان، غزه من زمان وهي نفسها تحلم في الامان.
انت لما دخلت غزه بكيت وعيطت، شو اللي خلاك تبكي وتعيط؟
الشغله فرح ولا زعل. فرح انه والامان موجودين، يعني اهلنا ناسنا حبايبنا يكونوا في امان. والفتره الثانيه انه كل الاسرى كانوا معي، اهاليهم كانوا بيستنوهم وبيتقبلوهم الا اهلي. استغربت، قلت معقول ماتوا زي ما قالوا لي، قصفوا دارنا زي ما قالوا لي، عملوا سووا زي ما قالوا لي. فجاه الحمد لله لقيتهم وطمنت عليهم الحمد لله. والناس لقيت في ناس كان على كلام الناس، فيش امن، فيش امان. الناس كلها بتقتل في بعض من قله الاكل، من قله الشرب. الناس كان
فاهمينكم في السجن؟
في السجن وغير السجن كمان، يعني العامل النفسي تغير. يعني انت لما تشوف واحد بيحكي عربي من غزه تتشرف انه اصلا من غزه، لو اللي صبر واللي احتسب.
ما شاء الله عليه. الله يشفيه ويشفي صدره، يشرح صدره وينصر كل الفلسطينيين وكل مظلوم، ويا رب يغفر لنا. Let yourself feel all of the feelings that came up for you while watching that clip. All of the sorrow and all of the rage. I know I sobbed a lot after listening to it and, cried out to Allah in dua. You might also notice the extreme dignity and humility and beauty of character and unmatchable strength of character represented by this young man, and he is a good representation of all of the people of Gaza. Now, a skeptical view of the clip might be, who's to say his account is true? People will, again, if they have the Just-World Fallacy in mind, they don't want to believe the world is unjust, so they're going to quickly find ways to come to the conclusion that this must not be true. The claims to injustice, this person must be lying. It's like when they immediately assume that a rape survivor is lying. Can't be possible that she could be possibly telling the truth, or he could be possibly telling the truth. Well, you can look at straight from the mouths of Zionist politicians very similar wording, like very direct calls for ethnic cleansing, very direct descriptions of all Palestinians, from babies to the elderly, being terrorists by default and not worthy of life, and it's, you know, our role to like exterminate them. We're finally at the last section of the video, which is to look into the just world fallacy from an Islamic perspective, basically to try to come to an understanding from my experience and based on my beliefs of how we should think of justice in this life and in the next life. I'm going to start by reciting an ayah from Surah Al-Baqarah for you. So it's a verse from the second chapter of the Quran. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أم حسبتم أن تدخلوا الجنة ولما يأتكم مثل الذين خلوا من قبلكم مستهم البأساء والضراء وزلزلوا حتى يقول الرسول والذين معه متى نصر الله ألا إن نصر الله قريب صدق الله العظيم. I keep losing I filmed this last part so many times and Clipchamp keeps not saving it. So if I look like I'm reading from a screen, it's because I wrote down what I said because I didn't want to forget it. You might so this I have just shared with you. The tafsir, there's many beautiful tafsir out there for it, interpretations, but what I really want to focus on is, for the purpose of this video, specifically the idea that we are promised that this life will be difficult. So far from this world being just, we are guaranteed that it won't be, that there will be trials. And that's the point. That's why we're here. That's what we're doing here. God has created us with free will, and we are put in a situation where, you know, given the choice, we are tasked to determine whether we would still choose to do and be good. And some people won't, and that creates injustice. And then how will we respond to that injustice? That's the whole thing. And so with the just world fallacy, people might look at hardship, whether from an individual level or on a societal perspective, and determine that it must be a punishment of some sort, right? Like they don't want to admit that the world is unjust. So a hardship must be a punishment. Therefore, it must be deserved. And if you have this worldview, you can see how it really lends itself to some uncompassionate conclusions about other people. Another thing you could do if you have the just world, if you're operating from the perspective of the just world hypothesis, is ignore injustice, live your life ignoring injustice. And then when you do see it, it will shake your faith. And that brings me to the problem of evil. A common atheist argument against the existence of God is basically, if God is all powerful and if he is most just, then why is there injustice on this earth? Why is there so much human suffering? Isn't that evidence that he doesn't exist? You know, why wouldn't he do something to stop it if he could? And the answer to that question from an Islamic perspective is pretty simple. It's basically that the capacity for human tolerance for suffering exceeds the suffering itself. There's basically no suffering too great on this earth that the human spirit was not created to withstand. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها would be another ayah from the Quran as an evidence for that. And Gaza is an evidence for that. What greater suffering could one face than the people of Gaza have not already faced? They've pretty much faced every human trial of extreme injustice and suffering imaginable, all one on top of the other multiplied. And yet, are they not the most faithful people you have seen? Contrary to the conclusion that God must not love them, they say Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakil. They really feel God's love. They really feel aware that he is truly the only one they can rely on. He's all they have. And so When I hear people talk about the problem of evil, my reaction is that sounds like your guilt talking. Because the truth is, often people talk about the problem of evil when they live in a position of relative privilege and they're looking at injustice from far away and they're like, ooh, that looks really nasty. That I'm not sure about God. The people who are actually going through the suffering, they are sure about God because they see this greater purpose and they've proven to themselves their own ability to withstand what they have lived through. Basically, what I'm saying is that the problem of evil incorrectly posits that the suffering on this earth serves no purpose. Who says it serves no purpose? The purpose of our time on earth and being tested is greater than the severity of the evil. Allah encompasses all things, including the evil acts of men. Now, I'm going to refer to my notes some more here just to make sure I'm not missing anything. How ironic that the greatest suffering in the world, as we see it in Gaza, has led so many people to find faith, to understand their purpose, the purpose of their time on earth, and to find humbling inspiration in the most resilient, down-to-earth people we have ever known. وَلَا زَكِي عَلَى اللَّهُ أَحَدٍ. It's not by virtue of the fact that they are Palestinian. It's not an ethnic pride thing. It's simply that there's a group of people who have been put to the test, and mashallah, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, they have risen to the occasion, while the entire rest of the world has largely, like the global community, has let them down. The ummah ma'al asaf has let them down. They have not let themselves down. They have risen to the occasion, and a lot of people have found their faith just by watching Palestine. Ahl Gaza believe that their time here is not about their time here, and that God bears witness to every enormous and minuscule action and thought that anyone experiences. That we believe, Muslims believe, that everything matters and that everything is being written down in our book of deeds, which will be weighed on the scale on the day of reckoning. And that we will be judged for our afterlife. So the hereafter is the time for ultimate justice, while this life is unfair. And that's by design, to test whether we will actually fight injustice when we see it. There's so much more I can say and so many verses I can bring in, lingering ideas left to explore. But for now, I will leave you with this thought. From an Islamic standpoint, we are told that this world is unjust. We are also told that Allah tests those He loves. And we are told that a key part of our duty on this earth is to fight injustice. So fight it.